Welcome, Dracuphiles, to Sundays with Dracula. Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own will. This is chapter 6 of Sundays with Dracula. I am Edward G. Pettit of The Rosenbach in Philadelphia, which is the home of Bram Stoker's Notes for Dracula. Over 100 pages of outlines, early plot ideas, and research notes compiled by the author over the 7 years he developed and wrote the book. It is an extraordinary record of the conception and development of a novel. We will see a few pages of that today. And joining me today as a co-host is Tucker Christine. Tucker is a musician who also composed and performed that piece, Storm into Whitby, that you hear at the opening and closing of every show. He is also a collector of all things Dracula and a barbecuer extraordinaire, which I will have to really sample one day, some of your products. But Tucker, welcome. Hello.
How you doing, Ed? It's been a while.
Yeah, it has. It's always too long when we're with the rotating co-hosts. I was saying to Josh last week that, I wish I could have all of you on every week, but too many heads. So
maybe at the end.
but I'm so happy to have you back, and thanks. And joining us today as our very first special guest on the show for this series is Dacre Stoker. He is the great grandnephew of Bram Stoker. He is the co-author of international bestsellers Dracula the Undead, which was a sequel to Dracula, published in 2009. Dracula, which was a prequel in 2018. I think you can see them over my shoulder. Dacre, hello and welcome to my house.
Thank you, Edward, and hi, Tucker. How are you? Good to see you both. I'm looking forward to a good afternoon. I understand you guys have had a heck of a following for the first 5 chapters, so I'm great to try to hold up my end on one of my favorite chapters, the emergence of the action in Whitby. So excited.
Excellent. Good. So yeah, I think this is, should be perfect today. Excuse me, I had to garnish my drink. I realized my drink had no garnish, and that's not good for the camera.
I've noticed you've got a very special red drink today, Ed. Is that like a blood red orange as well? What's going on there?
I do. Heck, we'll hit it right now. I had some other things to say, but this is a drink that you shared with me. Was it one of your publishers that come up with this drink as a promo?
Yeah, the Putnam publishers of Dracula, when they put together questions and answers and things to sort of scoop about Dracula to go out to book clubs, they recommended this cocktail. And so what they're recommending people, obviously, is to do is enjoy the book, but also enjoy the cocktail. And those things usually go hand in hand, don't they?
Yeah,
Ed?
well, for me, they do.
Yeah.
This is called the Vampire Blood Cocktail. And I'm looking at the rest. And Dacre actually shared it on our Sundays with Facebook page in the comments. And I can reshare that to make sure the recipe gets out there. But they've misspelled gin. They spelled gin V-O-D-K-A. And that's not how you spell gin. So I use gin in it. And it's gin, blood orange juice, some sugar syrup, and pomegranate juice. And I put a little, blood orange garnish on it there. And there's a few pomegranate seeds floating in the bottom.
Cheers to you. Hey, Tucker, what are you lubricating with today?
I'm drinking scotch.
There we go.
Which fancy scotch is that today, Tucker?
I've got a mystery beverage.
It is called Flaming Heart. It's from Compass Box. It's a blend.
Nice.
Beautiful. All righty. Well, on Sundays with Dracula, we are spending 27 weeks talking about Dracula. The novel takes place over 27 weeks, from May 3rd to November 6th. There's 27 chapters in the novel, so we're talking about 1 chapter a week for 27 weeks. I have a co-host or 2 each week, creating a kind of conversational annotation for the entire novel, 1 chapter at a time. And we had to reshift and miss last week and restart now. So actually, the series will end now on November 8th, which is, Dacre, and November 8th is?
Bram's birthday.
Bram Stoker's birthday. So that'll be real nice. We'll do our last show on his birthday. Bram Stoker's notes are not the only gems in the Rosenbach's collection. We also have, all kinds of manuscripts and first editions. But one of our prized possessions is the manuscript, James Joyce's handwritten manuscript for Ulysses. It's a complete manuscript. It's not just a chapter or 2. It's a complete manuscript. And so the Rosenbach celebrates Bloomsday every year on June 16th. this year, since we cannot have a big outdoor festival that we usually have on the street with a beer garden and 70 some readers come up and read from the novel, we've put together a virtual Bloomsday experience, which will last from 11 in the morning until just after 8 o'clock at night. Readings all day long. Let's see, you can find more information about it on our Facebook page, which I will share with you right here. Virtual Bloomsday Festival. We start broadcasting at 11 in the morning. What we're doing is every hour on the hour, starting at 11 through 7 o'clock, we will post a video of readings, greetings from Bloomsday participants around the world, from Dublin and all kinds of other places. It'll be a lot of fun. There's music featured. It's a really fun day. And if you would like to support the Rosenbach to help us bring you more shows like this or all kinds of things, especially on Bloomsday, you can go to our website during the day. You can donate money. You'll get this great little Bloomsday sticker or a Bloomsday poster illustrated by Rob Burry, who works closely with the Rosenbach doing a lot of Ulysses things. And I hope to see some of you. Well, I hope you'll see me. I'll be reading at one point, but I hope you'll tune in and experience Bloomsday with us. It is it's the greatest thing we do every year. I mean, quite frankly, it's so much fun, and I'm so happy actually to do it virtually this year, because yes, I'll miss being with everybody on the street and having a big party about Ulysses. But actually, we're going to reach more audience this year. I think we'll be able to have more people attend virtually and experience it that usually doesn't happen. So, so that's on Tuesday, June 16th, Bloomsday. I'm sure you're already going to celebrate. I will be watching it all day long. During the show today, if you've registered, you're watching on Zoom, remember, use the Q&A box. If you have a question for the three of us, and I will be monitoring the Q&A box. The chat box is there as well. That's for chatting amongst yourselves. Don't forget to switch the chat to thing to all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, it's just the default is to all panelists, and every week somebody is usually commenting constantly and no one's reading it because it's not to all attendees as well. So that is where we will go. Tucker, yeah. One of the things I didn't really get to ask you, we talked about your interest in Dracula and collecting and that kind of thing, but I didn't really talk to you about your music last time. And before we get started today with Dacre and talking about the book, especially because you composed it's Storm into Whitby, right?
Storm into Whitby, yeah.
The Storm into Whitby song that we used at the start of the show. Talk a little bit about the music that you play and how you came up with this song in particular, and go ahead.
Well, I've played in bands all my life, and then when I got to be in my 20s, I started having kids and got married, and life took over, and I dropped it for probably about 7 or 8 years, and then I guess Father's Day one year, my kids got me a guitar lesson with Dweezil Zappa, and I hadn't played guitar for 6 years at that point.
Like like with him actually?
Oh yeah, with him.
That's really cool.
It was a master class, so it's 13 students and Dweezil teaching for about 2 hours. It was really excellent, but it reignited the fire, and I got way into it.
I know you're a big Frank Zappa fan too.
I'm a huge Zappa fan.
Yeah.
The name Pleated Gazelle is a Zappa reference.
Yeah.
But I have with personal life and work life, I have no time for an actual band. So I just started making music myself. I play everything, I write everything, and I just throw it out there for whoever wants to hear it can hear it. It's no real promotion behind it. It's just a hobby, but it's fun.
And this song, Storm into Whitby.
Storm into Whitby. Well, when you and I started discussing this, you floated the idea of me writing something for you. And I remember that the first week, the song I wrote was it was a theme song. It was 30 seconds long.
Yeah, we had a different piece the very first episode. You go back, everybody listen to the first episode, and there's a different piece of music.
And you can actually find that on Spotify also. That was called Sundays with Dracula. But then even I agreed it was way too short to be. I mean, you had to replay it 20 times to get the 10 minutes out of it. I
listened to your Storm into Whitby like a little over 2 minutes. I listen to that on a loop all the time.
Well, yeah, and I think it's a better piece anyway.
Yeah. Any more Dracula vampire inspired music in the works?
So prior to you asking me to do this, I was already working on an EP of Dracula themes, not theme songs, but music from movies, from the different composers. So I was working on a Philip Glass piece, John Williams piece, Wojak Killar piece, and I'm hoping to have it finished by October. But with quarantine, it looked like that was going to happen. But with business picking back up, it might be pushed back a little bit. But
okay, but that's good news in a way. I'm glad.
Yeah.
Take some business in. So excellent. All righty. Dacre, I'm so happy to have you. We've had you at the Rosenbach before. We had you on your book party for Dracula and I know other times as well. Talk to people a little bit about the kind of work you do with your famous great grand uncle and great grand.
Great grand. Yep.
Yeah. And the work you do with and of course the books that you write.
Well, we'll try to keep this within sort of 4 minutes or less, so we can so you can all stay on track here. But
I don't keep anything within that kind of thing.
The short version is that I was interested when I was a young guy in Montreal, Canada, but who my direct links were, and that was obviously my great grandfather was Bram Stoker's youngest brother. He was George Stoker, and he was quite a well-known doctor. Traveled and served in these kind of like MASH units in the Turco-Russian War, the Zulu War. Bram helped him write a book. They were very close. He actually lived with Bram when Bram was the theater manager at the Lyceum Theater, and George Stoker actually helped Bram take care of the illnesses of the actors and actresses. I actually have in my possession, passed down to me, a beautiful little silver bowl that Ellen Terry gave George for essentially saving her life. Now, it sounds she had a big splinter in her arm that created a bad infection and a fever. In those days, that's pretty close to a death sentence. And George was able to help clean it out. Yeah, I don't know if bloodletting was involved, but basically, got her back on her feet again. And so there was a cool connection between George and Bram. The wonderful story of Bram pulling the suicide victim out of the Thames River to try to revive him, for which he won a medal. George was the one that helped him also when he got home with them to revive him with an early version of CPR. They weren't successful, but Bram did get a bronze medal from the Royal Humane Society. So the more I got into understanding my direct relatives, I also then had to figure out, what was Bram Stoker like? What was Thornley Stoker like? And of course, Bram had all the, the press, because, this was the beginning sort of in the 70s that popular culture was looking at Bram. They'd already figured out Dracula. But because McNally and Florescu came to your museum, Ed, looking for a woodcut and found the Dracula notes, they wrote this book In Search of Dracula that helped sort of the world understand Bram Stoker and how he came up with the name Dracula. Mm-hmm. And that's how I was really educated. And fast forward to sort of 2003, when I get this phone call out of the blue from Ian Holt, who says, I would love to have a Stoker involved in adapting the screenplay that I have into a novel. I want to have, it'd be cool to have Bram Stoker in the story. How much do you know about Bram Stoker? Would you like to get involved? And so I was the only one at the time in North America that really had some information about Bram. And I went back to one of my uncles who had plenty of it. And then I started getting in touch with some of my cousins, who I believe 2 of them may be online listening today.
I did look.
Bram's great-grandsons.
Yeah, I looked up for Noel Stoker and Robin McCall. I didn't see them on the list yet. Maybe they'll tune in at some point. So
well, there's a 5-hour time change, but Noel Stoker,
it's a little later.
Noel Dog, Robin McCall are Bram's great-grandsons, and they were helpful as well as sending me things. We didn't have great internet back in the day, so I was getting mail. I also went and visited them and found the lost journal that Noel actually had in a box of things. So there's cousins involved, there was an uncles on my side, and I just, because of just my interest in sort of the Stoker lineage, became the de facto guy in the family that is really interested in this. And the more biographies I read, the more conferences I went to, the more useful I was as a co-author with the undead. And that's, that we could shoot forward to the Lost Journal and Dracula, with different co-authors. My key, Ed, is to go to these places that Bram set the story, go to Ireland, where Bram grew up, because I'm really interested in the human side of him, is finding out the why Bram wrote things. There's what he wrote that everybody knows. And actually, they don't all know his short stories and his other stories, but I'm really interested in the whys. And that's sort of the human side of me. I was a school teacher. I was actually an Olympic coach for Canada in the sport of modern pentathlon, and figuring out about how people tick. And of course, Bram Stoker was very interesting in that regard. He had a strange, mysterious childhood illness. He recovered to be a champion athlete. And then he goes on to write all these books with lots of outside influences that sort of come into his world that assist him in the writing. And that's really what has got my attention up to this day. Great.
All righty. And you've been so busy, not just in putting together kind of, creative material, the fiction, and then also the law. I think the Lost Journal might be over my shoulder too. But also now putting together some products, which I'm always happy to plug. There's an Etsy on Etsy. There's a Dracula store, and
there is a Dracula store. I mean, I've been motivated because so many people come to me and say, "Oh, there's this great texture with some of these, some of the novels, and also things that are inspired by the novels." So as Ed kind of goes through, you can see books and pillows, T-shirts, and then I'm just such a junkie for early edition covers. Like I'm wearing a shirt.
I just ordered this new original artwork, long sleeve, black shirt. I like that a lot.
Oh yeah, that's cool. Yeah. So, we want to try to make these things accessible to people. It's wonderful to go to all the libraries and the old books and go to Abe Books and see if you can afford one of these early editions for thousands of dollars. But why not sort of bring it home to folks? And, a Dracula first edition tie and a lady's scarf, and the shirt that I'm wearing is just hot off the boat. And these will soon be available. So we're working on these types of things to sort of bring this cool texture and artwork. Yeah, we just launched the bobblehead.
That just came
Absolutely,
out
just on Friday. Yeah, those are available at the Bram Stoker Etsy store this weekend, actually, and also the BramStokerEstate.com website.
Bram's looking rather thin there. You've really, thinned him out. I think he might have appreciated that if he was around today.
We didn't have to pay as much money for quantity if we made him a young guy.
Yeah, there you go.
Exactly.
And
I think, are we late?
Well, something coming up soon too, because we're going to have there was another group of items here.
Yeah, show that photo, because I think you were talking about the Dracula notes, and of course it's like a pilgrimage for Dracula fans around the world to make their way to Philadelphia to go look and study these notes. Well, we decided to bring these to products as well. Obviously, we've played with the colors a little bit to make them a little more sort of antique looking and sort of a little bit more colorful. But yeah, we've added this stuff. We've kind of imagined Bram Stoker's writing desk, where you can see a picture of him, a couple of drops of ink, the map he actually used to chart out Dracula. And yeah, so we bring these products to you guys, not because we don't want people to go visit the Rosenbach, because I just think they're so cool and such a piece of literary history.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love these. I love this kind of, these kind of products. And when all of these new items featuring, Stoker's notes are ready for purchase, I will send out an email to everybody who's registered for Sundays with Dracula that will contain a coupon for 20% off any items in the Dracula store for 7 days.
It should be somewhere around early July. These should be ready for purchase.
So these look absolutely wonderful. So yeah, that's great. I'm always, and well, Tucker over there, the collector.
The scarf that you just showed, which is the same print as your shirt, I ordered that and had all my face masks made out of it.
How about that? You took the scarf itself and made the face, because I saw you with a face mask.
So I was able to, with the scarf, it was big enough I could make 4 masks out of it.
Wow, that's totally cool. All righty. So there you go. Not only, can you enjoy the items, you can recycle them in interesting, creative ways, as Tucker.
And the first thing I did when I woke up on Friday morning was order that bobblehead.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Excellent. I do have one question right now that I'll throw at you, Dacre, from Steve sets out. Steve asks, what are the themes of the short stories that Bram wrote? And I guess that's maybe, I mean, as a giant general question, but maybe as kind of relates to his most famous book, Dracula.
Well, I mean, the one that relates the closest, obviously, is Dracula's Guest. And I could go on and on forever, but I believe, I'm not the only one, but I believe there is proof to show that that was once part of the early manuscript or typescript of Dracula, because there are references to in the typescript. So that's obviously very Dracula-esque.
Here's a question I have for you. I wonder if you have some information on this. We don't know, you know, like how it was kind of shaped for publication, Dracula's Guest, at all. I mean, or do we? Do we know who may have actually edited it into the form that it is? Because it's clearly not just a piece right from an old manuscript.
No, it's obviously polished. Yeah, Ed, that's a good point. We know that his widow published it with some other short stories after Bram died, and her preface to that book, you know, says this was actually excised due to length from my husband's most famous work, Dracula. But obviously, it needed a little bit of. You don't just take 101 pages and leave them in a pile and somebody has published it. Somebody would have had to polish it. But it's very obvious Jonathan Harker stopped in Munich en route to Transylvania, and he gets waylaid in some adventure. And there is a presence of Dracula in that story. He writes a letter at the end without spoiling it. So that's one. There are some other short stories.
Spoil away on this show.
Okay.
I told people, spoil away.
I mean, his short stories run the gamut, really. There's one of my favorites is The Squaw, which is a story of a newlywed couple. I kind of think it's sort of semi-autobiographical of Bram and Florence going to Nuremberg. I know that Bram and Irving and crew would go to these countries when they were scoping out the design of sets. And they would go to places to look at, number one, plays that they could adapt, and what do castles look like so we can adapt our sets for the Lyceum Theater. And I don't have actual proof, but I'm pretty sure that Bram and Irving went to Nuremberg. I think what he did was probably use that experience to pretend that was his honeymoon. And it's a gruesome story of him meeting an American that follows the newlywed couple around all day long, and they end up in a torture chamber. And because the American did something horrible to a cat, the cat gets its revenge at the end. So that's one of my favorite. Yeah,
and very Poe-esque the story is.
Very,
I've read several critical works that kind of relate Poe to that story, and Bram must have been very aware of Poe's works, as he was, and as many people were.
I'm actually working, Edward, to get. I can't disclose everything because of NDAs, but I'm trying to get some of these short stories turned into graphic novels.
Ooh,
because I look at approachability in a literary world, and it's like people, oh, do I buy a book of short stories that's kind of dull and boring? But boy, if they're in a graphic novel, that's sort of cool. So that's one of my sideline projects.
Or just a different way to read story. I read comic books. One of the things I've been so bummed about during this whole shutdown is the comic industry shut down, and I finally got a couple comics last week because they've started distributing again. But no, I read comic books, so I love that format, that graphic format of seeing pictures and text, and so great. I love that. Excellent. Well, before we jump into some revenants and then the chapter, I just want to remind everybody we have more special guests coming up next Sunday on the show. We will have with my co-host Josh Hitchens, we will have Grady Hendrix here. Grady is the author of the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which was on the New York Times bestseller list. Grady is an excellent author, and he also, if you look him up on the web, is Grady Hendrix' website, he has a great podcast series that he's been doing about vampire lore, and it's hilarious. He's hilarious. It's really funny, and he also really knows his stuff. So I highly recommend that. Grady will be here next Sunday. And then on June 28th, joining us will be Gwendolyn Kist. Gwendolyn is the author of the Stoker award-winning story, The 8 People Who Murdered Me, an excerpt from Lucy Westenra's diary, which is a great story. And you can read for free online, Nightmare Magazine at their website. And on July 5th, Joining me will be and the co-host will be Leslie Klinger, author editor of the Annotated Dracula that came out several years ago. He's also done an Annotated Frankenstein, which is fabulous. His Annotated Sherlock Holmes is the go-to annotated Sherlock Holmes now for any Sherlockian out there. So we've got a nice run of guests coming up. Dacre, I'm glad it was you to kick this off.
Thank you.
And let's get started. This is a segment I'm calling Revenants now. Tucker, the segment's called Revenants. And it is things that are still haunting me after we've talked, after we've already staked the previous episode. And I'm trying to gather my notes, and I'm seeing questions that I didn't get to sometimes, or chat questions or chat comments, or just things I discover. And this first one comes, so this is a question from Carrie, and this was asked last week and we didn't get to it. And she asked, do you think the Gothic tradition of found documents, including like Shelley's monster finding his creation notes, the found documents from Walpole's Castle of Otranto, the founding, Gothic text, really is part of Dracula's structure? And we did talk some about that. We talked in the beginning about, the found documents, the way these kind of different narratives are pieced together, and that Stoker has gotten probably a lot of that inspiration only because Wilkie Collins's Woman in White was so massively popular in the last half of the 19th century, and that is pieced together with different narratives. But now that Carrie mentions it, it's true. Not only, as I was thinking about it, not only works like the first Gothic text, Walpole's Castle of Otranto, is it starts that way. But Frankenstein too, I hadn't thought of Frankenstein as a found text, and it is a found text story. It's not just a creature finding the text, but it's the way the story is kind of discovered by Walton the explorer from Frankenstein, and he has, and there's letters that are put together to start it with. And then I started going down the road too. Jekyll and Hyde is an actual found documents thing with 3 or 4 different narratives that are pieced together after the whole story's over. I was thinking Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper are journal entries of how a woman is gaslighted. That there seems to be this kind of thing called, it's like the uncanny story that has been found, and oh my gosh, can you believe that? And that's the way Dracula opens. And then the more I thought about it, it's actually a pretty well used trope, especially in horror and supernatural. I think the Blair Witch Project is like found video journal. One of the greatest horror movies ever, the greatest horror movie ever made, hands down, in which a found audio journal that accompanies a book, the Naturon de Monto, that will unleash all the evil into the world. You all know I'm talking about The Evil Dead, the greatest horror movie ever made. And that's a kind of found document thing. So have you guys ever focused on, Dacre first, have you focused on this kind of thing about these found documents as it relates to Dracula?
Well, it's funny you say that, because that's sort of been my whole journey is finding the documents that create the standpoint that, for instance, J.D. Barker and I took for Dracula. Finding the Icelandic preface from the 1901 version of Dracula that was sitting in Iceland. Nobody knew it was different. And it says, as Bram says in the preface, this story is true about 18 times, very convincingly so. So when I combine that with the first interview that Bram Stoker ever gave to Jane Stoddard in the British Weekly, Bram says it's based on truth, and so on. And so I sort of did the same thing, finding these different documents to put it together to then justify as a fictional author, how can you use these things to sort of state your claim, but also make it feel historically real. And I think Bram sort of did the same thing. He's chosen real places, real people, real events that happened, the Demeter coming in, the things at the London Zoo. And that makes people feel, I think the reader feel very unsettled that, holy smokes, this might really have happened. As they say, the willful suspension of disbelief because the insertion of reality. And I think that's what's got my attention. And it's been very helpful for me as an author.
Excellent. Tucker, I know you're very well versed in, horror films and books as well. Is this something you've kind of seen, do you think?
Oh yeah, like every book that you mentioned, you have all the movies that you mentioned. You have the VHS series. Uh,
Yeah.
but I like Leslie Klinger in his annotated version takes even a step further, and he acts as if this was real,
It is real, yeah.
and this is what Bram changed to hide the identities, and this is might be this he got this a little bit wrong, but is it really wrong, or was it just fixed a little bit,
Hmm.
and Baker and JD carried that on into Dracula, which was excellent.
Yeah, great. All right. So thanks, Carrie. Thanks for connecting that idea of found documents with kind of really the whole tradition of Gothic horror, supernatural. I think it is really strong, and Bram's, right there in the midst. And not that the only thing that Bram Stoker wrote were, supernatural stories. Is some of his other fiction is not about the supernatural, but certainly when he was doing this work and delving so deeply into it, that's the form that it takes. So excellent. Are you guys ready to jump into the chapter for today? We are on chapter 6, everyone. And this is Mina Murray's journal. Now, both of you guys have been to Whitby, I know, and you both
I have not. I have not, Ed.
Oh, you have not? Okay.
No, I was planning it when the whole quarantine happened.
That's right. You're in
Happened.
London, but not in Whitby.
Yeah.
Well, Baker, I know, has been, and that's where we're visiting right now. It's the chapter starts 24 July, Whitby. Lucy met me at the station, looking sweeter and lovelier than ever, and we drove up to the house at the Crescent in which they have rooms. So first, the date. We've jumped ahead. We've jumped ahead 2 months from her last, journal entries. We've gone from the end of May to now the beginning of or the end of July. It's a jump of nearly 2 months, and that is it's a little jarring, but it's jarring in the way that I think, as a reader, you come to it and you think, like, what's happened since then, and you only gradually get to know. But it's also not much. It's in a way, I think this kind of invisible editor of this story, is kind of like, I'm going to cut out the stuff that doesn't matter. I don't need 2 months of Mina saying, wonder where Jonathan is, wonder where Jonathan is, and 2 months of Lucy talking about, and wasn't this a great thing that I did with Arthur? Wasn't this a great thing that I did with Arthur? Because I'm sure that's just the content of their letters back and forth. But Whitby, northeastern port, that had become a vacation spot in the 19th century. I mean, the 19th century is this kind of rise of the middle class, rise of a leisure class who do some shocking thing, which I don't do actually, which is take vacations. That people think that's like just such an ordinary thing, and there's no really such thing as a vacation really before the 19th century. If you were wealthy, you may have traveled, you may have done a tour kind of thing, but for regular people to go on vacations and spend time like that, that's a new thing for the 20th century. And Whitby is one of the places that become, you tell me first, because what I think is, first it's just a port city, I mean, for shipping and fishing, and then it also becomes a vacation resort. Is that true, Dacre?
Yeah, they actually have a big history there of being a safe haven port for the ships, the coal ships going up and down the North Sea. And one of the cool things that Bram jumped on was this harbor that has a very protective kind of series of piers called Collier's Hope. And if the ships that pass there have to pay a toll, because if they need to come in to get out of the bad storm, they slip into Collier's Hope. And obviously that is important because that's what happens with the Demeter. Let me just back up just a sec, because what's interesting, and I do need to give a shout out to a fellow named David Pybus. And if any of the listeners are interested in following Facebook, David Pybus and a group of his folks from the Whitby Museum, they actually created a Facebook page called Bram Stoker's Holiday back in 2013. And David is a lot like Elizabeth Miller. They really like to get all the facts just right. So you've got to check out that Facebook page. And because they've posted a few things since 2013, you've got to scroll back. But they go into tremendous detail. And some of the things I'm going to be bringing to you today are right out of the work that they did. So this is the footnote to them. And he notices and mentions Bram Stoker arrives for his holiday in Whitby, July 29th, 1890. And the story is, Mina's first entry is July 24th. So as Ed was saying, this is the holiday season. It gets pretty darn cold in Whitby. So the water sort of warms up a little bit. The weather gets nicer sort of middle of July. So it makes sense that those socialites were going to head over to Whitby that time of the year.
And even by today's standards, that water's never warm.
No, it's
That's
not.
like North Sea. That water never really gets the temperatures of like other kind of beach places like southern United States or, anything.
No, it's like Maine the whole time. But
yeah.
the cool thing to me is, and I sort of felt it when I went there, I was there in November, if you can believe it, in 2014. A Canadian filming company was doing a video on sort of, how vampires entered into popular culture, and it was called Real Vampires, and it got it on the History Channel, and they wanted to interview me in Whitby and wanted to look at things. It was pretty good, but I'll never forget arriving. First of all, we drove in these production vans with all the equipment and the sound guys and everything else, and we arrived at around 10 o'clock at night in the middle of November, and it was dark and it was drizzly and it was cold, obviously, but we needed to meet the head editor of the Whitby newspaper, John Stocco, who was our guide. And we met at this restaurant, pub at the base of the 199 steps. And I forget the name of it now, the King something. But we got there and the cobblestones were slippery. There was a sea mist rolling in and it looked very ghost-like. And John said, look up there at the Abbey, and which is illuminated, and you could see this whiteness of the clouds around the windows. Some people say that's Saint Hilda, the ghost Hild, who was one of the original Abbyists. And so I was experiencing some very similar vibe as Bram Stoker was, obviously, 100 years or so later. But I sort of felt why Bram Stoker fell in love with this place. He got there for 1 week before his wife and son did. So he had a whole week to wander around. And when you look at the Rosenbach notes, you kind of see the very next day, he's already meeting with people and getting the feel for the place. Remember, Bram loved the ocean. Born and raised Clontarf, Dublin, used to sneak out to Greystones to do his early writing. And Whitby, and then Cruden Bay, Scotland. I think he was drawn to these places because the sense of adventure. And also he loved to chat with all the fishermen, the Coast Guard guys, the lifeguard guys. Why is that? He needed good content to put into his book.
And the notes are rich, and we'll share a few pages today, but over the next, I think, 3 weeks or so, whatever, how long it is that we're still in Whitby, there's a lot of content that we can look at for the notes, and we'll see a couple of those pages later as well. Tucker, do you have anything on your notes on Whitby and kind of in general as a place that he chose?
Not really Whitby in particular. I did just rewatch last night the 77 Count Dracula.
Yeah,
which was shot there, and it's
Louis Jordan. They filmed there. Oh.
Yeah, it's just so gothic, and just his appearance, That is I do want to say, as you know, I was 9 years old when I read this the first time, and this was my least favorite chapter and the one I almost gave up on because of Swales.
Because you hit that dialect. We'll get
I read a mass market paperback version that had no annotations whatsoever.
I have no idea what he's saying.
It made no sense to me whatsoever.
Yablins? What's yablins? What are you talking about, old man?
But as I've gotten older, this has become one of my favorite chapters.
Good. All righty. I love that, and that they really that 77, that BBC production of Dracula. It really utilizes that that setting well, and they film there. They film right there. They film the steps. They film in the graveyard.
You got everything.
And that's absolutely great looking. But also Whitby Abbey itself, which it even I think says in the text about being sacked by Danes, and that's why it's a ruin now. And here, for the kind of theme of the novel, this invasion that is happening with Dracula coming from and invading England.
Well, I did note that as you go through here in the beginning of this chapter, he's drawing parallels really between Whitby and Transylvania, between the battle-stained roads in Transylvania and the being sacked by the Danes, and then you're going to get Transylvania has all the world's superstitions, but you're going to hear the legends of Whitby also.
Yeah, we get the peasants of England, in a sense, as we have the peasants of Transylvania, and it's brilliantly put together. I am every time I reread and dive deep into this novel, I am struck again and again with the care that Stoker put into putting these things together and having it all work.
Ed, I'm convinced, if you can imagine that first week, let's say any three of us, we're all creative guys, you go to some place and you go to Whitby and you're struck by it. I mean, we believe he's already started writing the novel at this stage before he takes his holiday. And there's a good chance that he was actually in the London Library beginning to look at these things. But what's critical is the atmosphere that he absorbs from this location. But not only that, just as you and Tucker had said, he loves to sit down with these different sort of aficionados, and Swales is one of them, with all these stories that expand the story to the Greenland fishing fleet and put Whitby. Where does Bram get it? He just doesn't sit down and start Googling what happened in Whitby. That doesn't happen. He's got to find the sources. Mm-hmm. And Bram seemed to love to do that. There's records of him doing it in Cruden Bay for his other books. And endearing himself to these guys who are the great storytellers. And so, I'm with you that the Swales dialect is really tough sledding to get through. But I think he wanted to represent where all this good stuff came from and create a sense of reality with it. Yeah. And so we see with this guy Pethernick, the Coast Guard guy, that he actually extracted the information from for the wreck of the Demeter. He had to somehow either take this guy to lunch or buy him a scotch or go get invited into this hut and hang out with them for a while. That's what Bram Stoker did. He was like an investigative reporter, which he did some of that in his life, but it was all for this novel.
Let me ask you one more thing then, before we get off the first sentence that we talked about.
Sorry.
He mentioned, no, I love this. That the second part of that sentence is we drove up to the house at the Crescent in which they have rooms. Now, it really appears later in the novel that this is an actual house and they have servants, and it's not an inn or a hotel that Lucy's family is staying in, nor would they. But is there any way to know where that is and what he was referring to? Is there a crescent there?
Absolutely, there is the Royal Crescent, and to this day, which is bizarre. No, it's not bizarre. It's not at all. David Pybus did this. He has mapped out everything as close to reality as possible. There is a number 6 Royal Crescent, but he has found what he thinks is the right building, which is a big sort of a half circle, sort of these beautiful old Georgian buildings, and a person has bought one of the flats, and they've turned it into Bram's View, which they believe is the same apartment they're in. But Pybus has done his homework and figured out this was Mrs. Veazey's guest cottage. And the reason they know that, it was a custom back in the day to have everybody listed in the newspaper of who was in residence, what guests were here. And so Pybus has got the newspaper, and it's on the Facebook page. You can see when Bram Stoker arrived, who else was in Mrs. Veazey's guest house at that time. And there were a couple of young ladies in there. Maybe they were instrumental in getting Bram to write about Lucy and Mina there. And then in the second week, when Florence and young Noel showed up. So we've got records pretty close to realizing what Bram based all this stuff on.
Where can we find that you were just talking about? What is that?
It's the name of the Facebook page is Bram Stoker's Holiday in Whitby.
Oh, that's from Bram Stoker's Holiday in Whitby. Okay, good. The webpage,
It's
yeah.
gold. He's got great posts, great images. It's really good stuff.
Excellent. Good.
Graham's View is where I was hoping to stay when we were planning our vacation, and hopefully next year it'll
Next year.
be able to go.
Next year, maybe I'll crash. I'll just show up. I'll know you're there, and I'll just show up. Hey, can I sleep on that couch? So,
Got to remember, I got 2 kids though, so you might be fighting.
All right.
I've actually been in it. The Stoker estate is actually licensed to them, you know, the ability to use that name, and we've given them stuff to put in there. They're really nice people, Tony Partingen, really, really quality people, and they've done a really nice job to keep it authentic and not make it cheesy.
Excellent. All right. Well, let's move on with the chapter, because, you know, she then mentions the ruin of Whitby Abbey, which we've talked about, sacked by the Danes. I love that, and which is the scene of part of Marmion. Any Walter Scott reference I love. I'm actually reading, what am I reading? I'm reading a Scott novel now, Tales of Old Mortality. You know, I'm usually either reading a Scott novel or thinking about one, because there's so many Waverley novels. Walter Scott was the most popular author in the first half of the 19th century, and then kind of people still read him up until the 20th century, when everybody just completely stopped reading him, and they only watch a movie of Ivanhoe, but nobody ever reads Scott anymore. And I love Scott. And it's interesting that Tugger, you mentioned the whole dialect that you get in this from Mr. Swales. Scott's, you know, one of his claims to fame was having his Scots people talk in this really hard to understand dialect. So almost any modern edition of Scott has a glossary in the back that you have to kind of consult frequently as you're going through it. But it's just that brief mention of Scott, and it's Marmion that Stoker knows his readers. Oh yeah, that's that extraordinarily famous poem from early in the century, but people still know it, and they still know who Scott is, and they understand that, you know, that's a kind of a very evocative thing to do, is mention Scott or one of his works. But then right away there's a big graveyard all full of tombstones. This is, to my mind, the nicest spot in Whitby. What a goth girl, huh? That she's picked like that's the nice spot. But then but honestly, in the 19th century, you know, graveyards, cemeteries in particular, you know, this is a churchyard, but cemeteries, which are places to bury the dead, which are not connected to a church, were not treated with the same kind of ick factor, you know, that like, oh, there's dead people there as it is now. Two things happen in the 19th century. There is, you know, or two kinds of ways that people think about cemeteries in the 19th century. One is the rise of cemeteries, because churchyards got too full after centuries of burying people in the same churchyard. They were constantly just digging people up and mashing them down to fit more people in, and disease was spreading, and churchyards were leaking into the water supplies, especially in cities. And so they developed cemeteries, which would be kind of on the outskirts of an urban area, and which were beautiful, like they are now. It's parkland with trees and grass, and then with because you're burying people, there's all this great statuary that's happening, and the leisure classes, the middle classes, love this kind of thing, and it's not unusual to picnic in a cemetery all throughout the 19th century. It's Sunday, let's go to the cemetery and picnic. If you happen to know somebody there who has been buried there, that's a nice connection for you, but it's not even necessary. And I think also the second thing, for people in the 19th century, cemeteries, or death itself, is a peaceful end of your life, you know? So it's about peace. It's about finally going to the place where you're supposed to go, which is to heaven with God. And so your final resting place of your body is not, people don't think of it as a place with corpses, but rather the peaceful, serene, outdoor garden for bodies that we can go and appreciate. I find those attitudes are changing now. People are starting to reuse cemeteries as places of kind of pleasure where you can go and enjoy yourself, and they're historical as well. I know in Philadelphia, Laurel Hill Cemetery has always been like that. It's this great historic cemetery that goes back about 1830, And I mean, great, historic for America. It goes back to 1830. And during the shutdown now, I was warned not to go because it was so crowded. There were so many people going because it's a beautiful cemetery and it's up and overlooks the Schuylkill River, and the kind of the architecture of the monuments there is gorgeous to look at, and it's huge. But it was packed with people, so people are starting to kind of redo that kind of thing. Dacre, you've been to Whitby, and is it, well, what do you think of the whole difference between the attitudes towards death and cemeteries in this book and the way we kind of view them now?
Well, I mean, there's no question that the top of the 199 steps, when you come off of the Tate Hill Sands, obviously where the Demeter wrecks in your other next chapters, and you get up to the top of the graveyard, you have a beautiful vista over both sides, the east cliff and the west cliff of Whitby. You see the ocean. You can see far in the distance any ships coming in, and so when the ladies are up there and they're chatting about just life in general, and the fishermen hang out up there, there's one other thing to consider. The air was not all that clean down in the bottom, sort of the ground level of Whitby, because there was a lot of peat being burned as well as coal. And I've seen old pictures. There's really a lot of pollution. But once you got up to the top, the winds blew and you had very clean air. And of course, you got to remember the streets, the sewage and things. It was not a really clean place down at the, down in the trenches. So folks to raise up and went up to the nice grass with the beautiful Abbey and the St. Mary's Church, the good view, but also the wonderful air. It was the gathering point, other than going down into the bottom part of Whitby where the pubs were, and then all the hard work was done with the men in the harbor and the fishermen and all that. So that's my take, and I could just again imagine Bram sitting up there wanting to endear himself to folks, look around, get a vibe for the place, what are the stories going on. He sat up there writing in his notebook on his knee, and Mina's doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, and I think especially that setting in Whitby, because the cemetery is so raised and above, and must be great to be there. So,
and I will tell you, even though this appears later, when the sun goes down, and just for the listeners here, and you usually get a really good sunset, and that red light from the sun does reflect off the St. Mary's windows, it does have the look of these two eyes. It is uncanny. I've gone over to that side of town at sunset time just to try to experience the same thing Bram did. And so when you get to that in the book, in the next chapters, that really does occur.
Good. I love it. So anyway, just something I want people to keep in mind, is something I always keep in mind, is that is about the kind of attitudes towards death, that Stoker's attitude, people of his time, people throughout the 19th century, kind of see this kind of physical death and what happens after death as in quite a different way than we do now. I mean, in the 20th century, we've developed, real separation from death, or at least we had for a long time. Hospitals and funeral homes were the places of death, not the home that you live in. Far fewer children die now. People often talk about how old that we live to now. It's not that people in the past didn't live till really old age. Plenty of them did, but it was that the average age of death is brought so low because of infant mortality and children dying. I mean, up to like 3 out of 5 children would die in a family in the 19th century on average. So many, but even if you survive to adulthood now, we have so many more cures for diseases. I mean, we have penicillin now that they didn't have in the 19th century. So over time, death has become for us not just something other or uncanny as it was for the 19th century, but also kind of icky and unpleasant, because it really is the last stages, and we separated ourselves from so much. But the 19th century, it's a very personal experience. So
well, it also gave rise, Ed, at that time, and I don't have written records of how interested Bram was in spiritualism, but I know one of his good neighbors, Mark Twain, was. And I think when you look at Dracula and you see some of the lines coming out of the mouths of different characters. This was a time, right now we've got people doing paranormal investigations on television all over the place. Well, back in the late 1800s, we had seances going on. We had, people claiming to be clairvoyant. That was a science, and there were people trying to debunk that. But that was sort of I don't know if it was the beginning, but that was like very popular to be considering this stuff as we're looking for the struggle between scientific evidence and what our brain may be telling us to do. And I think this is exactly, Ed, what you're getting at, is what's happening after death and all that good stuff.
And especially, it's Arthur Conan Doyle is a famous, spiritualist, and I believe
who was a good friend of Bram's.
Yeah, and the Victorians have this threat of death. Here's what I like to from Victorians to contemporary people. Victorians have this threat of death, and death, in a sense, is kind of come back to haunt the living, and that's their kind of anxiety that they have to deal with. And in contemporary times, we're constantly trying to transcend death. We're constantly trying to conquer every kind of thing that could stop our lives. So now death threatens us in a way that's kind of death threatens us because it's the end of us. We don't have, many people don't have that consolation that, oh, I'll just go off into this paradise. It's the end of us. And that's why I think vampires are so threatening as a death monster in the 19th century. And now the death monster is, of course, the zombie. And the zombie is literally a dead person coming back to threaten you. That's why zombies are so popular now, or more popular. And popular in horror always means it registers greater with our anxieties. And so people want to see more of it and experience it more. And vampires now, Pache everybody, but the most popular vampires in the last 10 years were Twilight vampires. And they kind of, that threat is removed from that kind of vampire, the threat of death thing. And what is so attractive about vampires now is that you get to live forever. Like I don't have to die. I don't, I could read every book I ever wanted to read because I have unlimited time. And that kind of attraction for conquering death has become something that I think has made vampires attractive in the 20th and now 21st century. But for the Victorians, that's horrifying that you would have eternal life, eternal physical life, that your eternal life is reserved for your spiritual life with God after you're dead. And we'll see some of that later in the novel, how people are horrified by the fact that of the idea of eternal life. Right? Would you guys live forever? If you could live forever. Now I know they take family and wives and children into account. Take that out of the equation. Would you want to live forever? Would you want to do everything you wanted to do forever?
I think you would get bored.
Tucker?
I think you would get bored.
Yeah, well then you can end it. You can jump in a volcano. So
yeah.
Dacre, do you want to live forever? I do.
I'm up to give it a try. I think I don't have enough time to do half the things I'm doing now. No. So I think if I live forever, I could probably do some pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, give it a try. That's what I like to say. Sure, I'll give it a try,
Think all the good drink. Think of the cocktails and the wine we could try.
Oh my gosh. So all the scotches you could drink, Tucker. You could
there's always new scotch.
Well, I want to start. I want to take a quick look at one of the notes here from Stoker's notes, and the notes themselves. Stoker really takes Bram Stoker, as opposed to Dacre, who's on the show. Every time I say Stoker now, I think I should differentiate. Bram Stoker takes the time to really establish the coastal port setting in this chapter. There's lots of description. It's really gorgeous, some of it too. And in the notes himself, as you were mentioning, Dacre, he goes out, he talks to people, he learns about them. And then in the notes, there are pages of notes on wind direction and how the wind would blow. He's always over researching everything. And I think that's why there's such great detail in this book, because he over researches so much.
Can I speak to that just for a sec? Because
definitely,
I'll try to keep this part short. you got to realize Bram's upbringing and education, that he was the head of the Philosophical Society, head of the Historical Society. He was also an athlete, but he also went back for a master's in mathematics. And then there was the whole creative side of him. So when I analyze the whys, like I said at the beginning of the show, I think, why did Bram go into incredible detail about all of the weather patterns? Because he had this precision side to him. He wanted to get things absolutely right, at least in his research. So he might have had reams of the dialects, of names on the gravestones, of the descriptions of what the wind patterns were doing. So and then he could narrow it down when it came to writing and saving words to write just the right way. But he also was a founding member of the Dublin Painting and Sketching Club. So he was an artist. Now, I've seen a couple of his sketches. That's a whole nother story. And you've got some, Ed, in the notes. And what Bram wanted to do is, again, get this thing right with where Kettleness was, Sands End, where Collier's Hopes was, so he could describe this accurately so people would look at that and go, again, maybe this is real. So that's that anal, organized side of Bram's brain working in concert with the creative side later on.
Let me share this one now. And it's certainly not, an aesthetically pleasing kind of sketch. That's not what he's going for. He's trying to situate himself so he can remember where everything is. And this is one of the sketches that he did of you see cliffs right here. And it's very difficult to read too. Well,
there's Collier's Hope down below. That's actually, you imagine a ship coming in between those two dots at the beginning, at the top. You come inside the big piers. The water is really rough outside, and you come inside to Collier's Hope, and they don't have Tate Sands on there, but that's where you come in for your refuge during the storm.
Mm-hmm. So the notes, have a few of these where he's trying to clearly set up something, so then when he's writing about it, he can then remember actually where everything was and kind of, know that the kind of graphic
visualize.
Visualize. Thank you. Visualize.
Well, because he actually didn't do the writing while he was there. He did the research while he was there. We think he did the writing up in Cruden Bay, Scotland on his holidays. So you imagine the guys can't take a picture, no screenshots, no Polaroids even. He's just got to sketch this thing out. So he's got the whole thing, in the notebook when it comes time to do the hard writing.
Right. Well, soon we'll get into dialect too, and then I'll show another page of how I researched that. But we got Mr. Swales. He is a funny old man. He must be awfully old, for his face is all gnarled and twisted like the bark of a tree. He tells me that he is nearly 100 and that he was a sailor in the Greenland fishing fleet when Waterloo was fought. And one of the first words out of his mouth is, "I wouldn't fash massel about them, miss." And your first, if you don't have a version with notes like I have with my Norton, you're like, "Fash massel, what the heck are you saying?" But of course, Bram himself was filling this with the kind of the dialect that he had that he researched in a book by Robinson of the and let me share this page with you. This is a glossary for Whitby that he was putting together, and not all of these words show up. Dacre, do you remember off the top of your head, or Tucker, how many words from this glossary show up? There is a number, and I can't remember it off the top of my head now.
No, I don't.
But this is only page 1 of the glossary, and I'm opening my facsimile notes now to see here. Actually, and on this page here, no, I don't have the number that appear somewhere. I think in the Drafts of Dracula it told me how many of these words appear. But in this one we have down here, we have Bog Ghosts. Is that what we have down here? Yeah, Bar Guest or Bog Ghosts down towards the bottom here.
Yeah,
and it's terrifying apparitions.
The Bargash is a kind of like the Conan Doyle's Hound of the Baskervilles. It's this big black dog that apparently haunted the Yorkshire area. And Bram did a masterful job of using something that was relevant in the area. So when the Count arrived in the wreck of the Demeter and a big black dog jumps off, he doesn't jump off as a wolf. He jumps off as the Bagast, the black dog that the people in Whitby would have understood. Oh yeah, I've heard about that. That makes sense, this horrible apparition.
Yeah. And there's 4 pages of these notes, or 4 pages of notes like this, that he's just put together with all of these different words that he could use. And then in a little bit, in just a little later in the chapter, we get this entire speech from Mr. Swales, which is kind of incomprehensible, you know, in a sense. And I say that as somebody who is also, you know, has been spending every day with Ulysses for the last couple months and gearing up towards Bloomsday. And it's not as you know, incomprehensible as, you know, well, and Ulysses isn't that incomprehensible. Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. And I should mention too, I should have mentioned this earlier, for Bloomsday coming up, Joyce not only knew about Stoker's about Dracula, but he also there are a few vampire references. I'm looking them up in the Ulysses text right now. 6 references to vampires in the text of Ulysses itself, and it's always this take on this line: he comes, pale vampire, through storm his eyes, his bat sails, bloodying the sea, mouth to her mouth's kiss. Tell me that Joyce didn't read Dracula. That is exactly what he read and he was referring to. And then in Finnegan's Wake, in Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, he I'm finding it now, because in Finnegan's Wake, he not only completely references Stoker, or not only mentions a vampire, but it's Stoker himself that he references in Finnegan's Wake. And it is, let's root out Bram Stoker and give him the thrall of our lives. It's Dracula's night out. So, I mean, shout out from James Joyce in both Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Another reason why everybody should tune in for Bloomsday. But both of those works, and especially Finnegan's Wake, Joyce is very attuned to dialect, the way people speak, and he cares not one jot whether or not you can understand it, because he's trying to capture some kind. In Ulysses, he's trying to capture authenticity of speech and how people actually sound. In Finnegan's Wake, it's much more experimental when he's creating new language in it. But that's one of the things that Bram Stoker does. Now, it's not like Bram Stoker's a modernist. He's certainly anything but that. He's very much a Victorian writer, but Joyce shouldn't always get the claim as the greatest Irish writer of all time. I think you know, Bram Stoker is certainly more read than Joyce is, and all my Joyce friends now are going to hammer me for saying that. But
one thing the listeners need to understand also is, I think, again, I keep harping on the whys. I believe one of Bram's missions in the Lyceum Theater with Irving, when they kind of struck that bargain in the Shelburne Hotel to sort of let's come together and make something special out of the theater and elevate the role of the theater in sort of London society. And Bram wrote an article about that years later. What was the sort of the duties of the acting manager? And he alluded to the fact that it was important that the actors and the actresses got their lines right, got their costumes right, used the right dialect. Mm-hmm. So it was this accuracy side of Bram, that mathematic anal, this is the duty of clerks of petty sessions side of Bram that's coming into play, to get it just right, even if the readers have to stumble over it like we're sort of chewing on a big wad of gum while we read this. But I think that's the why Bram did this. He wanted to make it feel authentic.
Yeah. And so this, Adam P. asked a question about the name of this. The glossary that Stoker took this from was by F.K. Robinson, and it was a glossary of words used in the neighborhood of Whitby. So it's literally Whitby dialect. I mean, I don't know if it's not, if you could call it like kind of Yorkshire dialect, especially in England. Dialects can change radically, within, very close proximity to each other. So, but the book itself was Whitby dialect that he was taking this from.
I'm pretty sure, Ed, that in the drafts, they only transcribe the words that he used.
They do, yeah.
Whereas in the facsimile, everything that he copied down is there.
They do, and in the drafts, they actually give a specific mention of how many of the words that are actually used, and I'm not going to find it quickly. Oh, wait, I am. Do you have it?
I don't have it in this room, no.
Oh, okay. It says that no, sorry. But he acquired, but again, it's like Decker was saying, he acquires this, vast amount of research, and then he picks and chooses the things that'll really work in this. Or for all we know, he used even more in earlier manuscript drafts of this, which don't exist and we don't have. So back to the text, we get Mr. Swales. He's talking to him. Lucy mentions, or Mina mentions in her journal, the steps are a great feature on the place. We've mentioned that they feature in, film versions, because it's this massive flight of steps, right, Staker? I haven't been there yet.
Yeah, 199 steps. And the interesting thing is about it is there was a cart path right next to it, very, 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 very steep. And Bram mentions that as well. That's how all the supplies would have to get up to the Abbey and up to the church. Of course, there's a lot more people living in the Abbey than the church, but they've also got these strange benches along the way. And of course, it's to rest the coffin on as people are being brought up to the graveyard to actually be buried. So to this day, it's 109 steps up, but people are always sitting on the coffin rest, which is pretty Gothic in itself.
Do you know how long it would take me to climb 109? like that would be like, all right, I'll do a bunch and then I'll have to stop and then a bunch and have to, like, that would take, that's going to, and I'll get there one day, obviously, Whitby. And that's going to be like a day that I'm going to figure to get up those steps. So these old.
Well, I'll tell you what you've got to do. You've got to recreate the Mina run from the West Cliff side of town at Royal Crescent to go and try to save her, her friend Lucy when she's having her interaction, let's just call it, with the Count. In reality, when I've kind of hoofed it myself, not at a flat out run, but it's about 25 to 30 minutes at a good pace. And then you get to the 199 steps at the end and you're kind of going into, heavy breathing. It's like, oh God. But in the book, Bram obviously shortens that up for Mina, who's not an Olympic runner.
Yeah, that's a heart attack for me, certainly. No way, and there's no way I would be able to do that. So going down the steps, I might be able to rush down them, boom, 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 boom. But but yeah, certainly up and running from, that's never going to happen. I would take the leisurely Mina stroll to the churchyard with a pipe and maybe a drink in my hand. So we have the steps, and then the next journal entry in the chapter is oddly enough dated 1 August. And you think, whoa, she's jumped ahead a week. That's actually a typo in any editions that we see. And it's a typo in the original editions that's pretty well, attested now that actually should say July 25. Her previous journal entry said July 24. Her next journal entry says July 26. This one should have said July 25. For some reason, it says August 1. It was just a mistake, but it's a mistake that gets repeated because it's in the first edition, and it just gets reprinted as that. So if you have an edition where it says 1 August, it's not 1 August in her journal. Look to the next journal entry. You're back into July. So so that's interesting, though. And then Mina talks about, I noticed that the old men did not lose any time in coming up and sitting near her, talking about Lucy, when we sat down. She is so sweet with old people. I think they all fell in love with her on the spot. Yes, as we mentioned last week, everyone loves Lucy. So especially the old men of Whitby, to sit down and talk with this pretty young girl who's so friendly and wants to marry 3 men all at once. She is quite the attraction. And then we really get old men and their dialect, you know, and as we mentioned earlier, you know, for people, I think for Stoker creating this, this is like, just like he had done in the previous chapters with Jonathan. These are the kind of peasants with talking about superstitions, talking about, you know, and Mr. Swales goes on. He has that long speech now about, you know, ghosts, these bonds and wafts and bogos and bargas and bogles, they be naught but airblebs invented by parsons and ilsome buke bodies and railway tutors. He's saying that ghosts aren't real. The stories that people are talking about, they're not real. People have been tricked into believing this stuff to very specifically to get folks to do something that they don't other incline to. I love this kind of, you know, because the difference here now as to what we had in Transylvania, the superstition capital of the world, is there's a peasant here who says, don't believe in superstitions.
Well, remember, he's a sea captain, and
yeah.
Imagine all these young crew members who have all these weird superstitions, and they're trying to obviously, you know, kill whales in Greenland, and all these guys have all these really weird superstitions, and he's just trying to, you know, don't be stupid, get back to work, that type of thing. So he's on the front lines in his whole life, of trying to push that down. But also, I mean, see people have a lot of their own sort of built-in superstitions. And what I think is really cool about this part, that is sort of subtle to me, but they allude to the fact that you've got all these headstones with no bodies in underneath. And that's the sort of spiritual side of it, because and that's what the girl Lucy and Mina are getting at. Well, wait a sec, this is a fake grave. Well, someone's died off of Greenland or somewhere else, and the family wants to remember them with a headstone in Whitby. So what does that do? It's Swales is saying this is a falseness. This is just to make them feel good. And so he's grumbling about the fact that this is sort of a fake, like fake news. You've got nobody here, but it's a remembrance. And then we start thinking, well, what about the spirit? And then we mention George Cannon, which gets into the whole idea of the suicide, which I'll let you get into.
I'll get that in a sec, but Tucker too. I'm thinking this really surprised me in this chapter, that because I had already had in my head. This is one of the new things I learned, is that I already had in my head that, like, peasants in Transylvania, peasants in, you know, England, and this is the kind of way he's portraying them, but they're very different, aren't they? That they're not, like, Swales is not superstitious.
But he does have his own superstitions, because he does believe that the dead have to present their tombstones on the Day of Judgment. You know?
Yes, I mean, I don't know if he's portraying that as a way that he, like, actually believes, but it's almost kind of because he's commenting on the irony of it.
Yeah. But he's dismissing other superstitions and accepting his own, which happens all the time anyway with everybody.
We all do, you know. I mean, well, we often disguise our superstitions by saying it's belief.
Yeah,
it's a religious belief. It's not super. Well, one person's religious belief is another person's superstition. It's all, you know, it all kind of, you know, blends in there. And I love what, you know, he winds up talking about there with those tombstones. And this is a very real religious belief in the 19th century, that people had serious reservations about this, because if you are a kind of, for the Christian religion, if you're a biblical literalist, you believe that, you know, you rise up from the dead at the end of time and go to heaven, and you're kind of restored in some beautiful form. But if there's nothing there for you to rise up, where are you rising up from? But also, like, if you've lost a leg, then you go up without a leg. And people were very careful about that kind of thing, that, like, your remains should be here together. It's one of the reasons why you weren't supposed to be cremated, is because then your body couldn't rise at the end if you had been, you know, burned to ash. And Swales makes great, you know, joke about it, about, you know, like, they need their tombstones to say, look, this is me. And look, prove that, like, see, I was a good person. And as he mentions with what Dacre alluded to, George Cannon, he talks about that. Then he starts to just really lay into the kind of, the authenticity of spiritual belief that is at least printed in the churchyard. And this George Cannon, it says that, how does it, here lies the body, or sacred to the memory, wrote all of them. Yet in nigh half of them there bain't no bodies at all. And then he says yablins a little later, which I love. I want everybody to try to use yablins as an interjective.
I actually had that in my notes also.
Did you? Good. You want to mention yablin? What did you want to say something about yablins?
No, I just had it as my favorite exclamation.
I know. And like, why haven't I come up with using yablins in the past? I don't know. But it is certainly a word that I want to use from now on. But then he comes up with George Cannon, sacred to the memory of George Cannon, who died in the hope of a glorious resurrection on July 29, 1873, falling from the rocks at Kettleness. This tomb was erected by his sorrowing mother to her dearly beloved son. And Mr. Swales completely, pisses all over that. And he says, he tells him that he committed suicide in order that his mother, mightn't get an insurance she put on his life. He hoped he'd go to hell, for his mother was so pious that she was sure to go to heaven, and he didn't want to addle where she was. He's funny and he's refreshing, and he's so realistic about how we're supposed to approach life and death and what it all means, and the ridiculousness of how we try to kind of rhapsodize death into some glorious thing. And Swales sees right through it, or at least he seems to see right through it here. And that long transcription that Stoker had, that long transcription that he had, let me pull this up, that he had written there. He walked Dacre, talk about the graveyard and how Bram took notes, and I'll share
Right. So again, we know from David Pybus's research that he actually strolled through the graveyard, and he didn't obviously have his typewriter with him. Bram finally got a typewriter at a certain point and started writing these things. But if you look at some of the names, he actually mentions Paxson and Braithwaite Lowry and Swales. Those are all. I've seen those gravestones.
Yeah. Yep. This is 800.
I've seen them all. They're all right there. And luckily, because they're like made out of a sandstone, which is local, they're all beginning to just erode away. But because the Whitby Museum is very interested in preserving these things, they've actually got a complete record of all of them. Yeah. So it's a good chance that Bram got some of these from the headstones, and also some from the books that Bram looked at in the Whitby Museum and Subscription Library, which again, Pybus did great work to show these were the books that were in the library at the time Bram was here. So we have a pretty good idea of what he was referring to. The one that's not real, which is very cool, is George Cannon. And in, I think the 1931, I'm not sure which movie it is. Maybe, Tucker, you just saw it. Was the George Cannon headstone in the 77 Louis Jourdan movie?
Yes.
Okay. So that is fake. Wherever you got that name, we're not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. But I did get once, here's a funny anecdote, because having been there many times, I've met the vicar of St. Mary's. And people who come to the goth festivals and visitors dress up in their great goth costumes, and they're always going up the steps, make their pilgrimage, and they're looking for the George Cannon gravestone. And they're also looking for the Count Dracula gravestone, because they imagine that he's probably buried there. And when I was introduced to the vicar, he goes, "Just one thing, Mr. Stoker, I'd like to ask you. Would you just somehow publicize the fact that Count Dracula is fictional and he's not really buried here? And the same with George Cannon, because I get it up to here that they're bothering me all the time with this."
Yes. Well, Dracula might be. He might be there. He just might be in a grave of the suicide,
hiding in the
you know,
suicide grave,
hiding,
which is
hiding away
obviously
there, which
yeah.
we'll get into later. There's a great story from Christopher Frayling that he tells when he shot his documentary series Nightmare, which he did about Frankenstein and Dracula and Jekyll and Hyde and Hound of the Baskervilles. They have one scene. I don't know if it's in the beginning of all of them in the credits or if it's just in one of the episodes where they created fake tombstones for props and, you know, had the smoke machine around them and all, and then shot there. And I think they were like Frankenstein and Dracula. And then after they were done shooting, and this was at an actual graveyard, and after they were done shooting, they left and they forgot to pick them up. And so they were left there, and people were commenting on them to the vicar or whoever it was that, like, why is a Frankenstein buried here, or Dracula, you know? So that had actually happened. At Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, there is a grave there's a gravestone for Adrian Balboa that was created for the Rocky later sequel. I think Rocky Balboa, when he's older and Adrian has died, and both of all the sequels since then. At one point in the movie, Rocky is there at Adrian's grave talking to her, and they've moved it like way over, so it's not among the actual graves. It's like soon after you come in, it's off on the left. You can go see it there, and for a Philly person, it's a place of pilgrimage. You need to go to Adrian's grave to pay your respects. But there's a tombstone right there for Adrian Balboa, although she's not buried there. And I'm sure there's people there that come in and have no idea and think like, hey, that's odd. They have someone buried right there, Adrian Balboa. I wonder who she is. So she was Rocky's wife. That's who she was. So she was, because of her, Rocky won the champion. He never would have won had he not met Adrian. So there you go. That's my Philly stuff for today. There's a lot of Philly stuff with, you know, Laurel Hill Cemetery and Rocky, and give me a few minutes, I'll start talking about the Eagles. So back to the chapter. Mr. Swales is funny stuff. He has a great whole paragraph of, you know, what do you call it? Dialect that you need notes for, or you just guess what it might say. And then after he says all this stuff about George Cannon, the suicide, poor Lucy gets upset. Lucy and I sat before that. Lucy's very upset to hear this, and then the find that I must go sitting on the grave, over the grave of a suicide, which is more forewarning for us. And if people have read this really rings it out that, like, this is going to come into play in the story, and this is Stoker's way of kind of highlighting this grave of a suicide and Swales that are going to come into play in the next chapter. But then Swales has a great comment. It may make poor Geordie gladsome to have so trim a lass sitting on his lap. I love that little detail in there. And then Lucy and I sat a while, and it was all so beautiful before us. And they're in a cemetery, people. And for you can do this now. My wife and kids and I, we've been taking walks at a cemetery that's near here because it's a really beautiful place to walk. And we can't go anywhere else. We don't want to be around too many people. But they're sitting there. It was all so beautiful before us that we took hands as we sat. And she, Lucy, told me all over again about Arthur and their coming marriage. That made me just a little heartsick, for I haven't heard from Jonathan for a whole month. And then a little late, and then it says, the text says, the same day I came up here alone, for I am very sad. There was no letter for me. I hope there cannot be anything the matter with Jonathan. And then at the end of that, I wonder where Jonathan is, and if he is thinking of me. I wish he were here. We'll talk a little bit about the kind of way that we know as readers what's going on here, but Mina doesn't, right?
Right. I mean, she's totally in the dark. There is something a little later on where she does say that she wishes she knew where to write or to go, which is a little bit ridiculous because she is in contact with Hawkins, who does know how to get.
Yeah, but even Hawkins shares a letter with her that says he's coming home.
Yeah.
one line, and Lucy can see right, or Mina can see right through that's not Jonathan. But this sense of, you know, kind of the audience knows what's going on, and I think Mina does it, and I think in a way it kind of really accentuates her, not just suspense of what's happening to her husband, but or not suspense, but rather her, you know, kind of concern, that, yeah, you should really be concerned because he's probably dead, is what I think especially first readers are thinking, that he's likely dead, and we'll discover later how he died. But she's, you know, she doesn't know, and so again, also there's a sense of unknown, that this is a supernatural novel. This is, you know, a novel, you know, a horror novel, that we don't know what's happening here, and a character needs to remind us that there's something going on that we can't explain, that we don't know what it is yet.
But it's also got to be fully odd to her because, well, she recognizes it as not being in the style of Jonathan. She also would have no idea why it wouldn't be, you know?
Well, I think her reasoning is that because it's so short, like Jonathan's not going to write a one-line note saying I'm leaving whenever, that he's not that kind of person, that he would include some more detail about it, and also the silence, because now it's been 2 months, you know, or I'm sorry, it's been a month since they've had. What was the last date? Was it June 20? The date that Jonathan knows? Like he says, I have the date now of my death, and it's
the length of my life. Yeah.
Yeah, the length of my life, and it's the end of June.
Yes, it's the last week of June.
So he has been out of contact at least since then, and that's absolutely not like him. It wouldn't be like anybody, but it is the end of the 19th century. So yes, there is, you know, you can telegraph someone, but Jonathan's in Transylvania. Who knows what could have happened with the mail, with him sending anything. He's sending it from, you know, places that are very far away, and he's not, and that puts people out of contact. So if this is happening today and you haven't heard for a month, you'd be calling the cops, you'd be calling embassies, like something has happened to this person. But Mina, at the end of the 19th century, you have to wait months before you can really know if someone is in danger, or is perhaps injured or dead somewhere, because of the time it could take for communication to reach people.
Well, I think today she would give it maybe 3 texts unreturned, and then she'd be calling somebody.
Really. So, would Jonathan have mentioned those vampire women in his text, or would he instead put that in a much more inclusive email that I can send to you?
It would have been encrypted in WhatsApp.
Yeah, well, his shorthand is encryption, so, you know,
Exactly.
At least the count it is.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, all righty, now we get the character that we all love now. Dr. Seward's diary comes up. Not Dr. Seward we all love. Very few people like Jack Seward, but everybody loves Renfield. And we get Dr. Seward's diary, and now we're going back in time. And what we get is this kind of catch-up time between where we left off Seward's diary last time, just mentioning Renfield and Lucy turning him down, and July 24 or 26, or that we're in Whitby. And Seward takes us back to June 5 about Renfield. The case of Renfield grows more interesting the more I get to understand the man. His redeeming quality is a love of animals. I love that. And after you've read it several times and you come across his love of animals, it's a very funny line. His hobby is catching flies. And then on 18 June, he has turned his mind now to spiders. And then on July 1, it all kind of comes to a head as to what Renfield has been doing with his flies and his spiders. He says that Stewart writes, he must get rid of them. He looked very sad at this. And then he disgusted me much while with him, for when a hard blowfly, bloated with some carrion food, buzzed into the room, he caught it, held it exultantly for a few moments between his finger and thumb, and before I knew what he was going to do, put it in his mouth and ate it. That's really disgusting, and it still grosses. It'll gross people out forever because flies are really gross. But Renfield replies, it was life, strong life, and gave life to him. And that is a theme that will pursue with Renfield throughout his life, his own life through this. Dacre, Tucker, talk about Renfield.
Let me say this again. I keep coming back to the why. Do you ever wonder, like, why Bram Stoker was able to, or how he was able to describe this guy with such great detail, and where did he come up with this crazy idea of, the eating of the flies? And
if I did wonder that, I would ask you, and I would say, Dacre.
Well, I have a theory. It's just a theory. It's unproven. But number one, we do know this. We know that Bram's older brother, Sir William Thornley Stoker, was the medical advisor to this novel. I've seen, when I've studied the typescript that Paul Allen, his estate, owns, I've seen his handwriting in there. You've got some of the notes with Thornley Stoker's drawings.
They're in the notes, yeah.
But he wasn't just a sort of what we call a physical doctor. He was also worked in a lunatic asylum, and it was the one that Jonathan Swift left money to make a hospital for lunatics. And Thornley Stoker worked there. And I am convinced, as much as he provided his brother with sort of some medical details about the blood transfusions, the type of knives to use, the exact detail for the trepitation operation on Renfield later on, that I'm convinced he also sat down with his brother and said, well, let me tell you about a couple of the crazy guys that I used to work with, or some of my old patients. I think they probably had that back and forth discussion so that Bram could come up with something that was based on a real patient. And I think that's why Bram got it with such great depth as he described this guy.
Yeah. I didn't know that actually until very recently, that I was kind of, or maybe you let me know of that I had known Thornley was very connected, was a medical doctor, and he became medical advice, but I didn't know Thornley was, or I didn't remember that Thornley was. It's the issue with me forever. Like, you read everything and then you forget 90% of it. And then you have to go on and keep being reminded of it forever. But Thornley was also involved with a medical institution or a mental health place as well, a madhouse.
And later on in this chapter, we actually see some references to specific things that Thornley did, which was advocate for this sort of being more humane to animals during animal experimentation. This was this time of great scientific advancement.
I want to get to that later, because there's a whole mad scientist speech that Seward gives.
Okay.
Hilariously ridiculous. I can't believe he says this. But anyway, and then Renfield is keeping a whole notebook in which he is kind of jotting down numbers, and what he's doing is he's listing all of the things that he eats and how many lives, and he's tallying up all the lives that he is consuming. Tucker, anything on Renfield here eating flies that you want to touch upon?
Not so much, but can we point out that Seward's kind of a dick, that he drugs Renfield just so he can steal his book?
Yes. And, well, we get it even more. Like he talks about how he even mentions in the beginning of this passage here that in July 8th there is a method in his madness, and then he talks about he's managed to get a sparrow. We are progressing. My friend has now a whole colony of sparrows. And before I get into the kitten, he is he's observing Renfield and letting Renfield do things that will kind of reveal his madness to Seward so we can learn about it. But it's also so dangerous too. Like, I mean, you call him a dick. He is a dick, but it's like, but it's dangerous. That's why he's being a dick here, because he's letting him be insane, and you're supposed to cure him from being insane, and you're kind of letting him pursue, and it's so dangerous. But we have to mention that whole passage where, you know, a kitten, a nice little sleek playful kitten that I can play with and teach and feed and feed and feed. And, you know, and then he says, how about a cat? He's like, oh my God, if I had only known, I would have asked for a cat. It's very funny, especially when you know what's going on. But it's horrifying to know, too, that he just wants to eat the cat and probably eat it raw at some point is what he's going to do because of all the, you know, it's the old lady who swallowed a fly and, you know, he's going to eat the flies and the spiders eat the fly, they'll eat, you know, and sparrows and then the cat. And that is the kind of danger here. And when he tells him no, his face fell. And I could see a warning of danger in it, for there was a sudden fierce sidelong look, which meant killing. This man is an undeveloped homicidal maniac. He's not undeveloped. He's a developed homicidal maniac, first of all. I shall test him with his present craving and see how it will work out. Then I shall know more. So it's this constant testing the madness. And it goes back to what Seward had said in the previous chapter about how he's kind of taking, he needs to go take his patience, or at least Renfield, the method of his madness, and studying Renfield's madness, he needs to, in the last chapter he mentions, I need to keep him to the point of his madness, which he would normally avoid with other patients as he would avoid the mouth of hell. So Seward has previously said, to do this is like to teeter on the point of hell, to watch a patient in his madness, but I still need to do that with him in order to learn how crazy he is, and then I guess how to treat him. But his treatment seems to be, I'll just drug you and then take things from you.
Restrain you.
But I also love that theatricality that we get in there, that kind of Renfield's look. And this is Stoker watching the Henry Irving and the others play Mad Men. His face fell, and I could see a warning of danger in a sudden fierce sidelong look. That's like the look of somebody about to kill you. And I imagine that's a very stagey thing that Irving perhaps would have done before he killed somebody, maybe when he was playing Macbeth or somebody. That there's also that constantly in this, we'll find descriptions of characters who seem like they're performing on the stage, and that's the way Stoker is describing them. And it's great for a reader because you get a very visual look at someone. You get a very visual impression of what's actually happening with this character, as someone only associated with the stage and watching actors can do this.
And let me just jump in on that for a moment. When I've analyzed the edition that my cousins gave me and Robert Basang to work with for our next project, which is an annotated Dracula, it was a book that Bram actually crossed out 30,000 words. And a lot of those words that he crossed out to make the 1901 abridged edition are all these flowery words that you're talking about, all these sort of overly dramatic descriptions. So I think Bram...
Let's go back there for a sec. Let's go back there for a sec, because in a previous episode, I had talked, I think it was with you, Tucker, right? That I talked about, did we know he actually edited this, the paperback version where he cut, was it 20 or 30% out of 20-some% out of the text? And Dacre told me that we do know that Bram Stoker himself edited that paperback version because...
Well, yeah, because one of my cousins who may be listening now actually owns the first edition of Dracula, sixth printing, that actually has Bram's handiwork. And it's an incredible piece of work. You've got every single chapter in the table of contents, how many words Bram cut out. You actually see all the crossed out words. Some are big blocks of text with X's. Some of them he actually goes back and writes stet to actually put them back in. But he ends up with approximately 30,000 words that were needed to come out. And so you can see which parts of the story and Bram's sort of vivid descriptions of things were not that important to the story. That's obviously what he was asked to do, to keep the story together, but cut out the fluff.
Yeah. And so then that's the proof that he actually did do the editing for that paperback version. So
Yeah, and it was his handwriting. I mean,
yeah.
it wasn't like somebody else. You could actually see the notes in the margins, much like, that's a whole nother story, the notes in the margins of the London Library books. This was, again, I could verify these were his notes that he used.
Boy,
Any chance of a facsimile edition of that?
Yeah, that's something that Robert 18 Basang and I am working on for a Bram Stoker estate authorized annotated Dracula. It should be out this October.
Awesome.
which will include all this. Yes. So
We'll include all, you'll see in grayscale exactly what he cut out. You'll see references to the typescript that things are cut out. So it's kind of going to be a glimpse into the guts of the progress of this book.
So I wanted to mention that today too with Dacre, everyone. So if you didn't quite catch that, there will be another annotated edition of Dracula. You can never have too many annotated editions of Dracula. But this one by Dacre Stoker and Robert 18 Basang. Robert 18 Basang is the scholar who edited the facsimile notes with Elizabeth Miller. And Robert 18 Basang and Dacre Stoker are putting together an annotated edition of Dracula, which will also include, because of the way they've highlighted the text in kind of a gray as opposed to black, all the words that he cut out for the paperback version of Dracula. So this edition will have everything, right? It's
like a 2-for-1.
Yeah.
As well as we show which things were taken out from the manuscript or the typescript at the last moment.
Yeah, so there's the typescript that Bram Stoker edited later and took things out. So it's an all-in-one. For that now, I have to go to 3 different editions. Tucker, too, you have to go to 3 different editions to get it, to collate it all. This is all going to be in one, and that will hopefully be out in the fall, right? Is that the plan? Good.
Yeah, that's good. Let's get back to this.
Good. All righty. Renfield is...
He's drugged up. Big time.
Is drugged up.
It seems that opioid was the answer for everything, wasn't it?
Yeah. So, but he wants a cat and he doesn't get a cat. And, he's really pushing him, Seward, to find out, what his, is, and then he eats the birds and he disgorged a whole lot of feathers, which meant that he ate, he didn't eat a bird, people. He had a colony of sparrows is what he had. So he clearly ate more than one bird raw in his cell, just wolfing them down. And then he has this paragraph here. This is 11 p.m. Seward on 20 July. He gives him a strong opiate. He drugs him. And then he writes that I shall have to invent a new classification for him and call him a zoophagous, life-eating maniac. So I've always known that bibliophagous is a book eater, and I've used that. But zoophagous is a life-eating maniac. What he desires is to absorb as many lives as he can. And that's hence his journal. He's tracking how many lives. It's interesting that in the typescript, I did know, because they have the annotations of this in the Drafts of Dracula, that Seward discovers that it's just like, if a spider eats 10 flies and then Renfield eats the spider, he only counts it as one life, which doesn't make any sense, because what he should be doing is all these lives going to the spider. And Stoker cut that out. And I wonder if he didn't cut that out because, no, that actually didn't make sense. Actually, he should have been actually calculating in greater and greater numbers. But Seward goes on in this paragraph. Men sneered at vivisection, and yet look at its results today. Why not advance science in its most difficult and vital aspect, the knowledge of the brain? Had I even the secret of one such mind, did I hold the key to the fancy of even one lunatic, I might advance my own branch of science to a pitch compared with which Burton Sanderson's physiology or Ferrier's brain knowledge would be as nothing, if only there were a sufficient cause. And he goes on, and it's like, this is the mad scientist speech, right? Like this is right out of Frankenstein, that he's kind of, really justifying his practice with this mad patient to say it's all for the greater glory of mankind, and I'm going to be its discoverer. This is exactly, I didn't go in, and I should have just gone to the Frankenstein text and pulled out Victor Frankenstein saying a speech like this. Seward's not my friend at this point. Seward's dangerous at this point in the text for me. How do you guys feel about him? How do you say no, Ed? I don't, but you can clearly.
My opinion is we're going to see later on that he learned from Van Helsing, and Van Helsing's just as big a dick.
There we go. You've heard it here, folks. You heard it here first, folks.
Van Helsing could have just told him what was going on and solved the whole thing, but he lets it play out.
Yeah. It is interesting later, and this is something I want to bring up later too. I don't know if you'll be on a show or from the other people, but the fact that how Seward's approach is to observe crazy things that are happening and then kind of make them even crazier, so he can then come up with a way of dealing with it. And Van Helsing will do that again later as well. Dacre?
Yeah, I just want to say that this is that passage that we were going to get to about Thornley Stoker functioning as an advisor again. Thornley was on this strange kind of board in Ireland that was allowing vivisection to go on under certain conditions. So this is cruelty to animal act during scientific experiments. And I think when they referenced in this particular passage to Burden Sanderson, physiology of Ferrier's brain knowledge, these are issues that Bram's referring to that are hot burner point kind of issues that were happening right when the story was being put in real time in 1893. Right. So as people were reading Dracula, they would be able to identify with, as Tucker said, the craziness of Van Helsing and the craziness of Seward, because they were many doctors who were wanting to learn stuff, but were doing it in front of these operating theaters and being brutalizing these animals. Thornley's job was to step in and make sure that if you were going to do this, they had to have, certain care has to be in place, certain sort of drugs had to be administered. So he was like that calming influence. So this argument that Bram is kind of introduced into the story, again, I am sure it's his brother said, hey, you want some really cool stuff to go on between Van Helsing and Seward? We want to recognize how these guys and how medical science is advancing. Why don't you insert this stuff to make it something relevant and something people can identify with?
Yeah, Jack F. just has a question. Do we know Seward's treatment of his patients, how his patients' treatments compare to his contemporaries? It seems cruel now, but would it be considered more normal back then? I think you've just answered that he's using, what he can, especially from Thornley, to create this character of Seward.
Yep.
Mina's last journal entry. Let's get through that. It's 26 July. She is still.
Hold on, Ed.
Oh, go ahead. You want something else?
Seward ends with a great ironic line.
I was skipping over it because I thought we were running out of time, but yes, hit it then, because I love this. I love this.
If only I could have as strong a cause as my poor friend there, that would indeed be happiness. And he's going to get such a strong cause, and it's not going to be happiness.
Yeah, the irony of that is so telling. But okay, and to fully, to not just say Seward is some kind of fool. He has, just before that too, he has another thing like how well the man reasoned. He's talking about Renfield. Lunatics always do within their own scope. I wonder at how many lives he values a man, or if it only one. And then he has closed the account most accurately and today begun a new record. How many of us begin a new record with each day of our lives? That's one of Seward's observations about Renfield, and that as callously as we talk about him as a doctor, he's really focused on this patient of his and comes up with some observations sometimes that are really interesting, and also reveals to us, the reader, as you pointed out, as this is the direction that this novel is going. you know, and we're kind of getting lots of premonitions about things that will happen later. The things you don't notice until you read it for a second time. But when you're reading for the first time, you might not notice something, but it's certainly in your head. And it's certainly going to ring later well, when things happen. So I love his, you know, we get to, I might make fun of him, but when I come to a Seward, like with Seward's journal, I'm wanting to read, I'm more interested in reading that than I am the other ones. But of course it's about Renfield too. So it's fascinating. Let's get into Mina at the end there. She's still concerned. Jonathan hasn't come back. I'm unhappy about Lucy and Jonathan because we want to mention the one of the biggest plot points here that happens is Lucy, although she is so well, has lately taken to her old habit of walking in her sleep. Lucy is a sleepwalker, and somnambulalism is something that occurs frequently in supernatural fiction, and it is certainly a big topic of, you know, people, you know, who study, you know, psychology at the time, and late 19th century, that what is this stage where you are actually asleep but conscious in unusual ways? Dacre, do you have anything on somnambulism?
I do, and I'll keep this part brief, I promise. But 2 years ago, and I know I've seen Loki Hess is here in the chat room, and he's been lucky enough to also experience the amazing find of the books that Bram Stoker used for his research in the London Library. And I've been lucky enough to look at some of them myself, and I've then been purchasing some of them, not the same ones, but the same editions. And what's interesting is Bram was reading in one book by Herbert Mayo, who was a doctor, called Popular Superstitions, published in 1851. And there's lots of other books. We could go in for hours, but this particular book had a chapter on somnambulism, had sleepwalking, trance walking, vampirism. So we like to give Bram credit for an incredible imagination, but I think he had an incredible sense of imagination, but he also backed the stuff up with things that were credible and being read at the time, and issues that even a medical doctor like Herbert Mayo would actually write about. And that was this connection between the sort of the conscious, the unconscious, the way that when somebody's in this world of sleepwalking, that this is connecting to the spirit world, even though you're not totally dead yet. So again, it was sort of this modern, you know, emerging sciences or fringe sciences, the same as mesmerism, the ESP, that was a relevant topic at the time, that was being written about in proper published books, that Bram used to sort of like, this is going to resonate with my readers because it's not just me pulling something out of thin air. And I think that's a really relevant point to bring up. And if you have a chance to look more into the London Library and some of the neat finds that we now know, which are some of Bram's sources for some of these cool ideas, I highly recommend you do
I had
that.
shared a link to that not long ago on the Facebook page, and the video that was the librarian Philip
Spedding, yeah,
Philip
really
Spedding
good stuff. Yeah,
had put together, and Lucky, who is probably on the chat now, who tunes in every week, always has great comments in the chat. I was going to mention one of his comments earlier. I just, you know, I try to. I try to not say everything that we want to say, but he had a great comment because I had talked about Lucy Westenra, her name being Light of the West, you know, kind of, you know, as a translation. But Mina, her name, and it's actually Wilhelmina, and it says in the text that it's Wilhelmina, that her name is a protector. Wilhelm is the, you know, kind of the will to protect. And Wilhelmina is just the feminine version of that. And so her name means I am the protector, like she has the will to protect people. And that is the name that Stoker either consciously or unconsciously gave her. Or that's the meaning of the name that he unconsciously or consciously gave her. So, so Lockie, your comments are appreciated in the chat, and thank you for those. Lucy is a somnambulist, and this will come into play later. It would kind of her whole. We'll get into this later when Dracula arrives, but the way she is, and she even this 27 July, Mina mentions Lucy walks more than ever, and each night I am awakened by her moving about the room. And then she even says after that, Lucy has not walked much in her sleep the last week. This is on 3 August, but there is an odd concentration about her which I do not understand. Even in her sleep, she seems to be watching me. She tries the door and finding it locked, goes about the room searching for the key. Tucker, any comments on Lucy's behavior?
So when I was younger, I never understood why this was all one chapter. And it wasn't until later readings that I realized he was putting Lucy and Renfield together because because of their mental weaknesses, her sleepwalking and his mental zoophagous illness, they're both susceptible to what Dracula is putting out. And it took me 2-3 readings to actually understand why they were put together that way.
That's a great observation, and it took me until you saying it to thinking, oh yes, that's right. That's what we're getting here. We're getting, in a sense, the two people with the kind of mental issues who will then be, preyed upon by Dracula. I mean, Mina also gets preyed upon. Yeah, but the first two, first three, because. And I won't even spoil who's the first victim of Dracula.
But he apparently knows also. He seems to sense it too.
Well, all right. Well, we will spoil at the end of the chapter. We're going to get there in a minute. But that's a great observation. That yes, that this is a thematically linked chapter, and that it's not just the girls at Whitby. It is because we also get Renfield. And then it is what's wrong with the one girl at Whitby, that she is, having these episodes where she walks in her sleep. And just the very act of walking in your sleep, the kind of dream state, the kind of, it is not a living state. It is for someone who doesn't know what's going on, it seems like that they're in a trance is often, especially supernatural horror fiction, is kind of, in a sense, compared to a death state. It's the undead state. That's the original novel for this, the undead. You're not, and it's the unawake state. You're not quite awake. You're not quite alive because you're asleep, but you are functioning as if you are, alive. Just as a vampire is not alive, but functions as if it's alive. So that's her. She's walking in her sleep, and then she has this odd behavior, and I just wonder if it's this kind of, is Dracula psychically connected to Lucy and Renfield in some way? Now this is an idea that we can explore through these two characters, through the whole situation with Lucy as she's preyed upon, through the whole situation of Renfield as he is also preyed upon by Dracula. That how does he get these people, to kind of like, why does he choose them to begin with? And it seems Stoker doesn't tell us. Stoker in the book doesn't say this is what happens. But it seems if you just read the book, one of the things you can come up with is that they are psychically connected with Dracula in some way. Like as he's approaching Whitby, perhaps Dracula's psychic consciousness is reaching out, and Lucy is the one that he finds. And he's reaching out, and Renfield is the one he finds in London. And they're all connected. So, because it's a 19th century novel and everything's connected. You read any Dickens, you'll know that everybody is connected in some way. That is a point often of 19th century novels, is that we're all connected. So now we would look at that and say, that's just coincidence that they knew that. That's ridiculous. Why would you think that would happen? But that's often the point of a novel from an author in the 19th century, is to show that how we are all connected. And Stoker might be doing that here with choosing these victims. I want to hit the end of this novel because at the end of this chapter, it's August 6th, and Mina says, we are in for a storm. And then she writes, there's a brool over the sea. She's with Mr. Swales, and he's talking to her about this. And there's a brool over the sea that sounds like some presage of doom. Dark figures are on the beach, here and there, sometimes half shrouded in the mist. And this is language right out of the notes that Stoker has put together for this. And I'm gonna share that with you right now, because I love this little passage that he does here, and see if I can read it to you, because reading, or do you have the text for this handy, Dacre?
Hold on. I think I do. If I can just move this box.
Reading his, as you have long learned, reading your great-granduncle's handwriting is so difficult.
I'm afraid to move.
I'll hit it. I'll let Tucker, do you have it handy?
I could close everything out.
Yeah, I have it in an email that you sent me earlier this morning.
Read it right there, that gray day. Read this, because it's gorgeous language he's come up with.
Oh. Of course, I lost it.
All right, I'm going to read it just so we can get through this. But it says, gray day, sun high over Kettleness, all gray green grass, gray earthy rock, sand points jutting out all gray, gray clouds tinged with sunburst gray sea tumbling in over flats with roar muffled in sea mist drifting inland, horizon lost in gray mist, all vastness. I mean, he's obviously observed this himself, and he's kind of taken down these notes, and then he's adding them to the text later in his description. Clouds piled up and a brool in quotation marks over the sea, like a presage. Dark figures on beach here and there, men like trees walking, fishing boat going and coming through mist. And this is precisely this is the exact language, some of these phrases that he uses in describing, in Mina describing what's going on, looking out over the sea. And
that's why he had so many notes.
What's that?
All these notes Bram took on the weather. That's sort of the culmination of this one passage. And then, of course, in the next chapter, when the storm really picks up, that's why Bram went to the nth degree to figure out which direction the storm comes and what the ocean looks like when it comes, when the stars come in. He had to get it right, and did it sort of with the eye of a painter, is what he was.
Yeah. What I think is beautiful about it is that it's not a plot point note. It's a descriptive note, but it makes it almost verbatim 7 years. That was dated 90, and it makes it all 7 years. It almost verbatim right through.
And that he has been able to put these then in there, and that brool over the sea, and presage of doom, and dark figures on the beach, and this is the Mr. Swales and Mina are watching this storm approaching, and there's a craft out there, this that they see that's coming through the mist, which is the Demeter.
And you got to realize, people in Whitby were generally concerned, because when there was storms, that meant their loved ones, who were the fishermen who were out there, they were in great peril. And so there was a lot of effort put into having a proper lifeboat brigade. They had just got a brand new searchlight when Bram was there. So that was a very new piece of technology that Bram inserted into the story, the searchlight. They even had a rocket brigade, if you can believe it. So the town didn't just rest when there was a storm. There was a lot of concern if one of your family members, a loved one, was out on a ship. So this was a major news when something like this was happening, hoping that their ship would come into the harbor and the folks would be safe.
Digger, do you have the text available to you right there at the end of this chapter?
Yeah, I just was able to pull it up now, yeah.
Do you want to read Someday Soon, the Angel of Death? Start from there and read the end of Mr. Swales there for us? It's right at the end. It's the end of the...
Someday soon, the angel of death will sound his trumpet for me. But don't ye dole and greet my dreary, for he said that I was crying. If he should come this very night, and not refuse to answer his call, for life be, after all, only a waiting for something else than what you're doing, and death be all that we can rightly depend on. But I'm content for its coming to me, my dearie, and coming quick. It may be coming while we be looking and wondering. Maybe it's in the wind out over the sea that's bringing with it loss and wreck and sore distress and sad hearts. Look, look, he cried suddenly. There's something in that wind and in the host beyond that sounds and looks and tastes and smells like death. It's in the air. I feel it coming. Lord, make me answer cheerfully when my call comes. He held up his arms devoutly and raised his hat. His mouth moved as though he were praying. After a few minutes' silence, he got up, shook hands with me and blessed me and said goodbye and hobbled off. It all touched me and upset me very much.
Yeah, and Tucker, I just as you were mentioning, that's like Mr. Swales is seeing his death approaching in a ship that's right there, and it's true. So Dracula has this kind of, Dracula's not just this being that comes and does something like say like a modern monster, like a serial killer kind of monster. Like, I'm not just a murderer. He is this overwhelming force of nature and a kind of spiritual force that not only comes to prey upon people, but the people that he even comes to prey upon can feel him coming towards them, right?
Yeah, they all know it. They all know something, but they don't know what it is that they know.
Yeah. And then we get that other little paragraph. I was glad. Read that when I was glad. And then.
You want Tucker to read that or me to read that?
Tucker, read that.
I was glad when the Coast Guard came along with his spyglass under his arm. He stopped to talk with me, as he always does, but all the time kept looking at the strange ship.
That's what I love. I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, go ahead. Finish it. We'll just read the end of the chapter.
I can't make her out, he said. She's a Russian by the look of her, but she's knocking about in the queerest way. She doesn't know her mind a bit. She seems to see the storm coming, but can't decide whether to run up north in the open or to put in here. Look there again. She is steered mighty strangely, for she doesn't mind the hand on the wheel. Changes about with every puff of wind. We'll hear more of her before this time tomorrow.
And we will, but it'll be in another chapter. We get the Swales premonition of his own death. We get the Demeter said, and I love how it's described. It is a strange ship. Kept looking at a strange ship. I mean, I told people to pay attention to that language in the earlier chapter when Dracula starts speaking about strange and stranger, and he keeps kind of emphasizing that word. And now when the ship is coming in, that's the word that comes into Stoker's mind as an author, as a writer, that it's a strange ship. Of course, it's a strange ship because that's Dracula on it. He's the stranger in a strange land who's coming to invade England. Boy, I love that. So, Dracuphiles, as you're all be forever known now, thank you for tuning in today, or if you're watching this program on replay in the future, we will post this recording on our website for everyone else. So maybe if you had to drop out and have to come back, we have a Sundays with Dracula Facebook group, which has lots of fun things on it. And interesting stuff, and that you can, I'm on it every day. People are posting, and it's really great, where we can continue the conversation that we have during the show. So look us up on Facebook, join in the conversation. I'm also, of course, always available to answer by email. If you want to send me an email of asking a question, or if it's a question for Tucker, or if it's a question for Dacre, I'm happy to pass it along. Remember, next week's co-host joining me will be Josh Hitchens. Great actor, director, writer, horror theater maker extraordinaire. Josh Hitchens will be with me, and special guest Grady Hendrix next week, the author of the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, and then Gwendolyn Kist and Leslie Klinger coming up in June and the first Sunday in July. If you're looking for more virtual engagement in our quarantine world, make sure you head on over to the Rosenbach website. Check out all the virtual offerings we have. It's not just virtual Bloomsday. There's other programs coming up too. I also do a Shakespeare read aloud twice a month, in which I bring people on Zoom and we all read a Shakespeare play out loud to each other for, 3 hours or however long it takes to read the play. And it's a lot of fun. If you'd like to make a donation to the Rosenbach so we can continue to bring more shows like this and create even more programs and courses inspired by our magnificent collections, go to our website, click on the support tab. I would be more grateful than the kitten that didn't get adopted by Renfield. Tucker, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Ed.
I love having you here, and I think it's a special treat at some point in the future. I'm going to have a show where it's just all of us, all the co-hosts, and we just talk about Dracula in general. We'll do that towards the end of the season.
I think that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah,
it'd be great if this quarantine would end and we could do it in person.
Yes, and we will. And if it does, and the Rosenbach winds up having the Rosenbach is open to the public. My original plan for this whole series is that we would kind of finish the series at the Rosenbach and have a live audience and bring all the hosts in and do that kind of thing. Maybe it'll happen. It's such an unknown. It's like this novel. It's like we don't know what's happening. Some strange ship is coming to the shore. We don't know what's going to happen when it comes. Dacre, thank you so much for being our first special guest. You are wonderful.
You're welcome.
And thanks for all the work that you do in the novels that you create, and the research that you do, and bringing out the Lost Journal of Bram Stoker. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to ask you to be on again towards the tail end of this show. So I would love to have you back again.
Sure, absolutely.
To do that.
Yeah.
And you're the first person, as you know, you're the first person I asked. I'm like, I have to ask Dacre to be on the show. And you said yes right away. And then you also said, and I want to be on for the whole show. So thank you for that. I love this.
Well, you've done a great job to keep everybody in order and keep the whole, 2 hours just flew by like crazy. And thank you. Well done.
I'm the one that has to watch the clock here. And so that's what it is. Join us next week, everybody, for Sundays with Dracula, when we do Chapter 7, all about the strange voyage of the Demeter, off on a 3-hour cruise. No, that's the SS Minnow, right, guys? But this is a good parlor game.
Hey,
this is a good parlor game we could do on the Sundays with Dracula Facebook page, everybody. Let's cast the Gilligan's Island characters in Dracula. I'm assuming Gilligan is Renfield, like right off the bat, like Gilligan must be Renfield, but maybe not. Maybe someone will have something else. We'll do that.
There was actually a scene with a Dracula in Gilligan's Island.
Yes. Oh my gosh. So I'll find that on YouTube or something.
Find it.
I'll post that there.
Yes.
And we will Gilligan's the SS Minnow instead of the Demeter coming to Whitby. Once again, everybody, will be played out by Tucker Christine's pleated gazelle song, Storm at Whitby. Farewell, everyone. And in the words of our friend Dracula, go safely and leave something of the happiness you bring. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Tucker. Thanks, Dacre.
Thank you.
Love having you on the show.
Tucker, take care, man.
You too.
All right.
And I'll see you guys soon. Bye. Cheers, everyone.
Bye-bye.